Committee will come to order. Without objection, all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. We had a major operation we had to do here. We had to put a pillow here. Without objection, all members will have 5 days to submit statements, extraneous material, and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. We're here this afternoon to discuss the importance of the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, what we call New START, as a tool for limiting the most destructive weapons ever created, as well as the implications of that treaty expiring, which is set to happen in just over a year. To our panel of distinguished witnesses, welcome to the Foreign Affairs Committee. Welcome to members of the public and the press as well. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Since a strong bipartisan majority in the Senate ratified New START in 2010, the treaty has served American interests well. It put in place tough limits on Russia's nuclear arsenal. Its strong verification measures have allowed us to make sure Putin doesn't cheat, as he's done on other agreements. And the treaty gave us the flexibility to maintain an effective, safe nuclear deterrent to allow us to deal with any threats America faces. But to understand the full importance of New START, we have to go back to the start of the Cold War. For roughly a quarter century after the end of World War II, the standoff between the United States, along with our allies, and the Soviet Union was marked by an arms race. Both sides stockpiled enough devastating weapons to destroy the world many times over. My age is the age where we thought the Soviet Union would live forever and be our enemies forever. Then 50 years ago, the Nixon administration launched the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT. These talks were based on the notion that arms control, rather than an arms race, was the best way to keep the Soviet Union, now known as Russia, in check while avoiding a calamitous nuclear war. The SALT talks produced two groundbreaking agreements that were ratified in 1972 and in the years that followed. A bipartisan consensus formed around prudent arms control agreements as a key tool in advancing American security and keeping the Soviets at bay. Virtually every president since then has recognized the importance of arms control. President Carter signed the SALT II agreement. The first President Bush signed the original START treaty with Mikhail Gorbachev in 1991, and President Obama negotiated its successor, the New START treaty. At the time New START was signed, that strong bipartisan consensus supporting arms control still prevailed. 71 senators voted to ratify. Former secretaries of state of both parties spoke out in favor of it. It was a clear reflection of the old adage that guides our committee's work, and Mr. McCall and I have said this many times, that politics should stop at the water's edge. But in the years since then, we have seen a few strains of criticism. Some people just don't like arms control for ideological or political reasons. Some would welcome a new arms race, and some just seem intent on undoing anything that President Obama touched. If the treaty's opponents get their way, it will draw its last breath in February of 2021. At that point, absent some extension, Russia's nuclear forces would be completely unconstrained for the first time since 1972. Some of us here remember those days, as I mentioned before. We remember air raid drills and duck and cover. We remember Soviet nuclear weapons based 90 miles off the coast of Florida in Cuba. We remember when the threat of nuclear annihilation loomed over our lives. And when I look at Russia today, I see an unpredictable adversary. I see an autocratic leader in Vladimir Putin, hell-bent on undermining democracy, splintering the West, and restoring some 21st century version of the Soviet empire. The President suggested yesterday that Russia might not be a foe. Well, guess what? I believe he's wrong. And the last thing that we should want is for Vladimir Putin to massively expand his nuclear arsenal without any limits. No treaty is perfect, but with the clock ticking on New START, we need to ask whether we're better off with or without it. The answer is obvious to me, and I hope the Trump administration does the right thing and extends the treaty. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on these issues. I look forward to their testimony, pending which I recognize my friend, the ranking member, Mr. McCall of Texas, for for any opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing. This committee and you and I personally have worked extensively in a bipartisan manner over the years to highlight the continued threat that Vladimir Putin poses to the United States and to our interests abroad. Under the Putin regime, Russia has invaded Georgia and Ukraine, leveled devastating cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns against our Western allies, and meddled in our last presidential election. The Kremlin has also imprisoned and assassinated political opponents like Boris Nemtsov, attacked protesters, propped up the bloodthirsty Assad regime in Syria, sent submarine warfare capability to spy off of our coasts, and aided socialist dictator Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. In addition to all this, Putin is developing new weapon systems that violate international agreements that Russia claims to adhere to. In light of this, I agreed with President Trump's decision to withdraw from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty earlier this year after Russia's long-standing and clear violations. Arms control treaties are some of the most important international agreements that Congress is called upon to consider. The new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or New START, is the latest of these agreements, having entered into force in 2011. Unless extended in some manner, it is set to expire in February 2021. New START is not perfect. It only considers deployed nuclear weapons and does not limit or reduce the number of non-deployed warheads. In addition, it has not stopped Russia from modernizing its weapon delivery systems or prevented China from building up its nuclear stockpile. However, the treaty has been successful, resulting in a 30% reduction in deployed nuclear warheads and a 50% reduction in deployed launch vehicles. Jointly, the United States and Russia have exchanged more than 16,000 notifications about the movement of launchers and conducted close to 300 on-site inspections in both countries. According to the State Department's most recent New START implementation report, without the treaty, there, quote, would be a decrease in our knowledge of Russia's strategic forces, end of quote. And I find that very instructive here today. It also contributes to the national security of the United States. Yesterday, the lead arms control official at the State Department confirmed that Russia remains in compliance with the treaty. Despite these successes, we must be realistic about the future. Putin has proudly announced weapon systems that Russia is developing and deploying, some such as the SS-30, Satan II ICBM, and the Avangard hypersonic reentry vehicle that will be included under the rubric of the treaty. But Russia's advances in hypersonics and other so-called exotics have also resulted in new weapon systems that were not feasible when New START was negotiated, and thus would not be subject to the treaty's restrictions. I know that a few of my colleagues have strong concerns about extending New START. I understand and share some of these concerns. And as they have noted, the treaty places no limits on the deployment or stockpile of Russian tactical nuclear weapons or some of their new hypersonic missiles, which may not be covered by the treaty itself. I also understand the concern that China is not part of the New START or any similar treaty restricting its nuclear or hypersonic weapons. And while I'd like to examine the feasibility of expanding New START to address China's nuclear arsenal and Russia and Chinese exotic weapons, they have made it clear that they are not interested in doing so. And so because of this, we need to ensure that New START is extended in a responsible manner and that a strategic dialogue begin as soon as possible to negotiate a new arms control agreement with Russia and possibly China that addresses these outstanding issues. And Mr. Chairman, I know our offices have had extensive discussions about the future of New START, and I understand that portions of your amendment and the amendment I helped co-sponsor have now been included in the NDAA conference report, which is good news, and I look forward to seeing what comes out of that and continuing our conversations as we move forward. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. I'll now introduce our witnesses before asking them to summarize their testimony. Everything will be submitted for the record. Admiral Michael Mullins served in the United States Navy for more than 4 decades, capping a distinguished career by serving as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff from 2007 to 2011 and chief of naval operations from 2005 to 2007. Last year, he joined the board of directors of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, and since his retirement, he also has taught national security decision-making and policy at Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School and is president of MGM Consulting. Rose Gottemoeller recently completed 3 years as the Deputy Secretary General of NATO, where she devoted significant attention to NATO's relations with the EU, UN, Russia, and China. Prior to that, she served at the State Department as the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security and as the Assistant Secretary for Arms Control Verification and Compliance, in which position she was the chief U.S. negotiator of the New START Treaty. Pranay Vadi is a fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Previously, Vadi was a civil servant in the Office of Strategic Stability and Deterrence Affairs, Bureau of Arms Control, Verification, and Compliance at the State Department. He served as the Interagency New START Treaty Bilateral Consultative Commission, Backstopping Policy Committee Chair, and on the New START Treaty BCC delegation, and worked on the suite of U.S.-Russian arms control and deterrence issues. Kenneth Myers is the former director of the Defense Threat Reduction Agency and U.S. Strategic Command Center for Combating Weapons of Mass Destruction, an agency charged with providing the military and combatant commands with expertise, technology, and capabilities to prevent the use of weapons of mass destruction. Prior to that, he served on the staff of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations and worked for Senator Richard Lugar, whom we all remember warmly as the leading statesman on these issues. Mr. Myers now works as Senior Vice President for Defense and Security at PAE. I'll now recognize our witnesses for 5 minutes each, starting with you, Admiral Mullen.
Thank you, Chairman, Ranking Member McCall, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today on a vital issue that affects the lives of every American and, indeed, I think the security of the world. I'd like to submit for the record my full statement in support of extending the New START Treaty, and in addition, highlight for you now what I see as the key points in favor of extending New START.
Without objection, so ordered.
Based on my firsthand knowledge of the treaty and its successful implementation to date, and my belief that the Strategic Arms Control Agreements are an integral element of our overall nuclear policy and posture, I want to make 6 key points today. First, the New START Treaty contributes substantially to the U.S. national security by providing limits, verification, predictability, and transparency about Russian strategic nuclear forces. New START limits the U.S. and Russian strategic nuclear warheads and delivery systems and contains a robust verification and transparency set of measures, including extensive exchanges of data, notifications regarding the number and status of each side's strategic offensive arms and facilities, and on-site inspections to confirm that data. As of August 2019, the U.S. and Russia have exchanged approximately 18,500 notifications, and U.S. inspectors have conducted more than 150 on-site inspections in Russia, providing us a high confidence that Russia is complying with the treaty's limits and other provisions, and vice versa. New START also contains provisions to facilitate the use of national technical means for treaty monitoring. Indeed, without the treaty and its verification provisions, we'd be flying blind. Second, it is strongly in the U.S. national interest to extend New START for 5 years so that the United States and Russia can continue to realize the mutual benefits and stability it provides. I support a straightforward extension of the treaty. Measures that change or add new obligations to the treaty, such as bringing in another country like China, or new categories of weapons, such as non-strategic nuclear weapons, cannot, as a legal matter, be pursued through the extension. Such measures would require a new agreement and a new Senate advise and consent process. That said, it is certainly appropriate for the United States to seek an understanding with Russia about how the treaty will apply to any new strategic systems it deploys while the extended treaty is in force. This can be done in the treaty's Bilateral Consultative Commission, or BCC. Let me now address some of the specific concerns that have been raised in the United States in the debate over the extension of New START, Russia's new systems, and bringing China into the negotiations. New START will apply to the new strategic weapons systems Russia is most likely to deploy during the treaty's extended lifetime, and it provides the best means for discussing Russia's novel and emerging systems that could be deployed later. In the near term, we have very effective means to address the new Russian strategic systems that are most likely to be deployed in the next 5 years, and that is to extend New START. Both the Sarmat heavy ICBM and the Avangard hypersonic vehicle deployed on a Russian ICBM will be accountable under the treaty, as recently confirmed by Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov and by the Russian Commissioner of the New START Bilateral Consultative Commission. Getting that commitment in writing in the context of extension would be a great accomplishment for the administration. With respect to other strategic systems that are much less likely to be deployed during the lifetime of an extended New START, the treaty includes a provision stating that the party can raise in the BCC questions about the emergence of a new kind of strategic offensive arm. If New START lapses, we will lose the limits and verification we have on our Russia's existing strategic systems, as well as the only available vehicle for subjecting limits and verification to the two new systems most likely to be deployed. The alternative to New START extension is a nuclear free-for-all. No limits, no verification, and no predictability regarding Russian strategic nuclear forces. Any additional steps or agreements the United States wants to pursue with Russia or other countries like China will have a better prospect for success if the foundation of New START remains in place. It is critical to conduct a strategic stability dialogue with China, pursue transparency and confidence-building measures, and lay the groundwork for future arms control measures. But it would be an unconscionable mistake to sacrifice the benefits to national security of mutual restraints with Russia to the pursuit of an unlikely near-term arms control agreement with China. Regular and sustained bilateral nuclear dialogue between the United States and China is also essential for building transparency and trust and reducing risks of miscalculation and blunder. Robust U.S.-Russia dialogue on strategic stability and bilateral and multilateral crisis management mechanisms with Russia are essential and should be reinvigorated. Congress should encourage and support this. I urge you to support and encourage the expansion and deepening of these channels of communication with Russia to enhance the security of the American people and our allies. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Ms. Gottmuller, am I butchering your name? If I am, please correct me. No? Okay.
No, sir, just perfect. I've been called a lot of things, but you're pronouncing my name right. So thank you very much indeed. Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify before you today on the importance of the New START Treaty, as well as broader arms control issues of importance to NATO allies. Having departed the position of NATO Deputy Secretary General only in October, I am very aware of the interests and concerns of the allies in this strategically significant arena. I will give a few highlights of my testimony and ask please that the whole of it be placed on the record. Today, I would like to focus on two aspects of contemporary arms control. First, one that Admiral Mullen has already introduced, the importance of the New START Treaty. I will focus on its importance in regulating parity, that is, the equivalence of U.S. and Russian strategic nuclear forces. The second issue I would like to tackle is the problem of dual and nuclear and conventional capability in ground-launched intermediate-range missiles, an issue that has become especially acute in Eurasia with the demise of the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF, and thus affects U.S. allies in both Europe and in Asia. First, on New START, I know, and as Admiral Mullen has just discussed, a debate has been underway as to whether to extend the New START Treaty for 5 years from February 21 to February 26, as is permitted by the treaty. A number of arguments have been advanced against this step, including that the treaty does not control the new nuclear systems that Russian President Putin has announced on several occasions, most prominently in his speech on March 1, 2018. I do not find these arguments convincing, in part because, in fact, New START can play a role in regulating these systems, as Admiral Mullen has described. More importantly, we need to take a bald look at the question of whether New START benefits U.S. national security and what blows to U.S. national security would accrue should New START abruptly go out of force on February 5 of 2021. Without the treaty, let me just underscore, the answer is clear to me. During the coming decade, the United States will be modernizing its nuclear forces. If the treaty is extended until 2026, it will continue to cap Russian deployed warheads at 1,550 and delivery systems, missiles and bombers, at 700, giving the United States a stable environment in which to carry out the modernization of our nuclear forces. Without the treaty, things could change drastically and quickly. There is no faster way for the Russians to outrun us than to deploy more nuclear warheads on their missiles. This is not a new issue. Starting in the 1970s, the Soviets and now the Russians have built larger and heavier intercontinental ballistic missiles on which they can load more warheads at will, and they have plenty of them in storage. If released from the current 1,550 limit on deployed warheads, the Russians could readily add several hundred, by some account 1,000 more warheads to their ICBMs, forcing the United States into a difficult targeting problem at best and a strategic crisis at worst. The Russians, with their highly capable missiles, might be tempted to try to knock out the strategic command and control systems of the United States. Stability depends on such a temptation never taking shape. As far-fetched as it seems, that very scenario drove both sides in the arms reduction negotiations of the 80s and 90s to acknowledge that we must ensure parity in numbers of deployed warheads and delivery vehicles. We cannot afford to lose this parity or to cease regulating it. But if New START lapses, that outcome could happen fast, an outcome dangerous for U.S. national security. Therefore, I believe it is in our national security interest to extend the treaty to February 2026. Before I leave the New START treaty, I would just like to mention that the NATO allies, as well as our allies in Asia, do support extension of the New START treaty. Now, I'd like to speak briefly to the dual capability challenge. The problem of dual nuclear and conventional capability in intermediate range systems is an issue that has become especially acute in Eurasia with the demise of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, or INF. It thus affects allies in both Europe and Asia. NATO allies have been clear in voicing their concerns about it, and Tokyo and Seoul have also begun to do so. To begin, the unique difficulty that emerges from dual-capable intermediate-range missiles that are ground-launched is that they have either a very short flight time to target, as in ballistic systems, or operate in a stealthy mode difficult for radar to detect, as in cruise missiles. Warning time for those under attack is either very short or totally lacking. The missiles thus face decision-makers with the nightmarish dilemma of a no-warning attack that could be either nuclear or conventional. This is the very dilemma that led Soviet and U.S. negotiators to reach the INF Treaty in the period of 1987, and it did sustain stability by banning all intermediate-range ground-launched missiles deployed by the parties. Now the dilemma remains, but the INF Treaty does not, and I know this hearing is not about rehearsing the U.S. withdrawal from the INF, but I want to state clearly that I supported it, having personally been involved in 4 years of diplomacy to try to get the Russians back into compliance with the treaty. So I'm not condoning Russian behavior, but I do want to say that the Russians have spoken out to say, from a leadership aspect, both their Minister of Defense, Sergei Ivanov, and also President Putin, that they see the proliferation of these kinds of systems across Eurasia in the hands of the Chinese, the Indians, the Pakistanis, the North Koreans, and the Iranians as being destabilizing for them. Why they never attempted to resolve it at the negotiating table, I don't know, but we saw them violating the treaty and so have withdrawn. So I think it will be important to get China to the table, and I think we can pursue a phased approach with them, with China and Russia together, pursuing, for example, early talks on the issues and dilemmas that these systems represent, then moving on to statements of restraint, and finally moving in the direction of actual limitations and reductions on these systems. But I see the necessity of a phased approach to bring China to the table and to make it clear to them that their interests, too, will be served by constraints and restraints on these kinds of weapon systems. So with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you for your patience. I look forward to further discussion.
Thank you very much. Mr. Vadi.
Thank you, Chairman Engel, Ranking Member McCall, and esteemed members of the Committee on Foreign Affairs. I've submitted detailed written testimony for the record and will summarize my main points now. I hope to leave you with two main conclusions today. First, New START expiration exacerbates security threats facing the United States.
Could you pull your mic a little closer? Yeah.
It risks an increase in Russia's strategic nuclear forces and losing insights into Russia's nuclear operations. Further, treaty expiration will not address stated U.S. goals, like limiting Russia's tactical nuclear weapons stockpile or bringing China into an arms control process. These problems will remain unresolved after expiration of New START. Second, extending New START is valuable to U.S. security. Extension continues limits on Russia's strategic nuclear arsenal, which is modernizing as we speak. It also enhances U.S. allied relations. Extension will not create any new security problems for the United States. New START provides information on Russia's nuclear weapons for the U.S. intelligence community and military that is unlikely to be otherwise obtained. This information comes from data exchanges, notifications, and on-site inspections, which all show that Russia is complying with the treaty today. Under New START, the United States and Russia exchange a full accounting of their strategic nuclear forces and facilities through major data exchanges twice per year. They also exchange notifications, by latest count by the State Department, over 19,000 to date. Anytime a missile moves from one base to another, a new missile is produced or flight tested, or additional warheads are deployed on a system within days of that event occurring. Of course, the U.S. government simply does not take Russia's word with these data exchanges. On-site inspections provide short-notice spot checks with just over 1 day of advance notice. Russia is left with some uncertainty regarding what nuclear base may be inspected when an inspection is announced, which helps promote Russian compliance. These measures help U.S. defense planners design the appropriate sized nuclear posture to deter Russia, which is by far the largest nuclear power of any potential U.S. adversary. Verification also deters future compliance challenges and provides information not based on sensitive U.S. intelligence sources. This is useful information to have when engaging Russian diplomats on nuclear weapons issues. Russia's novel or exotic nuclear weapon systems have been in the news recently. I'll cover these systems in detail in my written testimony and welcome any additional questions you may have on them. I want to make clear that New START is actually a good story in this respect. Only two new long-range nuclear systems, the Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missile and the Avangard hypersonic glide vehicle, will likely be deployed before the treaty expires. Russian officials have agreed to bring both weapons into New START accountability, which is a credit to the administration's experts who pushed for their inclusion in the treaty. Already, Russia has shown the Avangard hypersonic glide vehicle to U.S. inspectors. Thanks to New START, U.S. personnel have laid eyes on the very first known deployed strategic range hypersonic glide vehicle Russia has ever fielded. They will do the same with the Sarmat ICBM once it's deployed. The bottom line is, the new Russian weapons that matter most to U.S. security between now and 2026, the furthest expiration date, should New START be extended for 5 years, will be constrained. Failing to extend New START will undo the limits achieved by the Trump administration on these two new systems. Yes, there are yet to be deployed nuclear weapons, which do not neatly fit into the treaty's definitions. However, it makes little sense to release constraints on the bulk of Russia's strategic nuclear force to try and limit a few developmental systems which are unlikely to be relevant to the United States before New START ever expires. Additionally, the Trump administration has argued that China should be brought into the arms control process. This is a worthy long-term goal. According to the Defense Intelligence Agency, China's warhead stockpile is in the low couple of hundreds, compared to the thousands of warheads that the U.S. and Russia maintain. Instead of attempting to limit China with the New START treaty, U.S. diplomats should prioritize keeping China from building up its currently small nuclear arsenal to challenge the United States numerically. This is not what New START was designed to do. Our differing goals with respect to China and Russia and their respective nuclear forces can be pursued more effectively after New START is extended. To conclude, let me state unambiguously that New START extension is in U.S. interest. Letting New START expire will undermine U.S. security. Extending New START will not create any new security problems. The treaty will continue to support U.S. national security goals, constrain Russia's nuclear arsenal, and provide a stable basis for the planned U.S. nuclear modernization, which will shift from development to producing new U.S. nuclear systems after the treaty expires. In addition, expiration would harm U.S. relations with its allies. For members here today, Congress has an important role to play in arms control policy. I encourage Congress to look seriously at the U.S. government's arms control workforce. Promoting diplomacy in this area, hiring and retaining the next generation of arms control experts are important missions the committee can embark on. The President can extend New START with the stroke of a pen. I hope that today's hearing will move the House and Senate to take up bipartisan legislation and further messaging to signal Congress's strong interest in New START extension. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Mr. Myers.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member McCall, and members of the committee, it is an honor to testify on the future of the New START Treaty. I'd like to summarize my written statement and have it submitted for the record. The views I will express here today are my own and not necessarily those of my company, PAE. I believe the New START Treaty should be extended before it expires in 2021. I reach this conclusion for two reasons. First, while the New START Treaty is not perfect, it limits Russia's ability to deploy nuclear weapons, and as long as Russia remains in compliance, it's in U.S. national interest to prevent Russian expansion of its nuclear arsenal. Second, the 5-year extension can and should be used to address recent technological developments and include China in expanded negotiations and commitments. The Russians are testing nuclear delivery systems not captured by the New START Treaty, and the Chinese are making significant investments to expand and modernize their nuclear weapons capabilities. As a result, I believe it is necessary to extend in order to expand. On a personal note, I would like to thank the Chairman and Ranking Member for naming the bill after Senator Richard Lugar and Representative Ellen Tauscher. I had the privilege to serve on Senator Lugar's staff for 15 years, and I am thankful to have worked for a true American statesman who made the United States more secure and the world a safer place. Mr. Chairman, treaties will never be perfect, and they are not panaceas. By their very nature, they are compromises between governments. As a result, they alone cannot ensure American security. During my time in the Senate, I participated in the consideration of many treaties. The concern heard most often was a level of certainty to detect cheating. President Reagan's famous dictum of trust but verify is heard regularly, and rightfully so. In large part, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, or DTRA, is the entity charged with responding to President Reagan's challenge. DTRA conducts the inspections in Russia and escorts Russian inspectors in the U.S. The treaty and technical weapons experts at DTRA are the very best in the world. They train and exercise regularly to maximize the verification opportunities under New START and other treaties. After leaving the Senate, I had the pleasure to serve as the director of DTRA for 7 years and testified in support of the New START Treaty in 2010. The agency supported the New START Treaty negotiations, providing analytical, technical, and linguistic support to then Undersecretary Gottemuller and her team of negotiators, to then Chairman Mullen and the Department of Defense, and the U.S. Interagency. Of the 56 members of Dr. Gottemuller's negotiating team in Geneva, 18 were DTRA personnel. They provided decades of experience and expertise to the delegation and played a critical role in the development of the treaty. DTRA was confident in and ready to make full use of the treaty provisions because they helped develop them. Mr. Chairman, I believe a rigorous verification regime is crucial to a treaty's success. I have no doubt that Russia will seek to ensure weapons such as the Boost Glide missile system remain outside the treaty, while also seeking to make it harder for the U.S. to verify compliance. I will defer to my colleagues as to the best negotiating strategy, but the technical skills of DTRA will be required to successfully capture the necessary delivery systems and avert loopholes that could be utilized by Russia and China. Engaging China will also complicate negotiations, but I believe their inclusion is necessary. Beijing's nuclear modernization and expansion cannot be ignored. The U.S. must not allow Moscow and Beijing to negotiate us into a corner or leverage gaps in the treaty's verification regime. U.S. national security will benefit from an expanded treaty that includes newly developed delivery systems, a growing nuclear-capable China, and a verification regime that ensures our ability to determine compliance. Reasonable people can disagree on what compromises need to be struck to achieve an agreement, but I believe a treaty that limits the threats to the U.S. to be inherently in our interests. Mr. Chairman, I fully support the ongoing nuclear modernization process here in the United States, but we must also understand that Russia and China are doing the same. Our deterrence and defense strategies are supported not only by aggressive modernization and continued investment in missile defense, but also by reducing the number of threats facing the United States. It is time that the U.S. get to work to extend New START in order to expand it. I want to thank the committee for the invitation to appear today. I applaud your leadership, and I stand ready to support the committee in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much. I'll now recognize members for 5 minutes each. All time yielded is for purposes of questioning our witnesses, and I'll start by recognizing myself. Let me start with you, Admiral. You held the most senior position on our armed forces and dealt with countless threats to our nation's security throughout your career. On the topic of arms control, we often hear people suggest that negotiating with an adversary is somehow a sign of weakness. Can you address this question? Do you think arms control negotiations can help strengthen our position vis-a-vis adversaries like Vladimir Putin's Russia?
Chairman, certainly the evidence in the last decade or two indicates that our relationship with Russia is a very difficult relationship, and I don't think that's going to change. One administration after another has tried to establish it, and it's very tough. What is striking to me is that in this regime, though, it has actually been pretty strong over a long period of time. Sometimes it's difficult to really understand why that happens. At a very high level, I think actually both sides, going back to the beginning of SALT, don't want to destroy the world, and that continues. So I actually think we are in a position of strength with respect to these capabilities. We both still possess the weapons which could, in great part, destroy the world, and I think there is underlying beneath all this the desire to make sure that that never happens. We've had strong negotiations with them before. They're difficult. They call for compromises, but not so far, at least the one I negotiated, not so much that we would compromise our security or the security and stability of the world with respect to these weapons. The worry that I have is outside those negotiations or outside these requirements, we have no way of understanding what they're doing, and we sort of open the door to a new arms race. In addition to, and it's been brought up several times, how do we get China into this? When I negotiated this in 2010 along with Rose, China was obvious at that time, and the question was, at what point in time do we bring them in? We didn't try to answer it back then. At some point, we need to do that in a very structured way. The fact that we've been able to control these weapons in this way indicates we can in the future. And as China continues to emerge and be a player on the global stage, there's an opportunity to do that. But that's long, detailed, it takes expertise, and there's no way that we could bring them in the short period of time that we have right now before this expires.
Thank you, Admiral. Ms. Gottemoeller, you recently returned from Brussels. After years of working directly with our closest allies, I'd like to explore the importance our allies place on arms control. New START is, of course, a bilateral treaty with Russia, but does it have an impact on NATO security more broadly?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, it does, because it provides for predictability and mutual stability with the Russians, and right at the heart of NATO defense ultimately are the central strategic systems of the United States of America. So it is the ultimate guarantee of the security of the alliance, and so to the degree to which there is stable predictability, to which we know what the Russians are doing, and vice versa, I want to stress that this is mutual, these are reciprocal arrangements. This kind of predictability is seen of great benefit by the allies, and as I mentioned in my remarks, they fully support the extension of the New START treaty.
Thank you, Mr. Vadi. Let me ask you this question about China, because many members of our committee are concerned about China, and we understand the Trump administration is anxious to include China in future arms control talks. Could you go into more detail on the state of China's nuclear arsenal? How concerned should we be about China's nuclear weapons at this stage as compared to Russia's?
Thank you for your question, Chairman Engel. So China has a nearly tenfold smaller nuclear arsenal than the United States and Russia.
Can you pull your microphone a little closer, please? Yeah.
China has a nearly tenfold smaller nuclear arsenal than the United States and Russia. Estimates from the U.S. government and non-government organizations put the Chinese stockpile number between 200 and 300. China has a declared no first use policy, meaning they have stated a commitment not to use nuclear weapons first, and they're satisfied with a purely retaliatory nuclear posture. China doesn't have any alert nuclear weapons. It keeps warheads demated from its ICBMs, though there's a debate in Beijing whether that should change based on actions by the United States as the relationship grows more competitive. In contrast to China, Russia is a nuclear peer of the United States. They roughly have the same numbers and types of nuclear weapons as the United States, especially in their strategic nuclear force. A greater overall number of non-strategic nuclear weapons, but a lesser stockpile of strategic nuclear weapons. Beyond the numbers, the U.S.-Russian nuclear weapons relationship is a relatively stable one. Each country has a means to annihilate the other through a survivable retaliatory strike. And the size of Russia's arsenal, its interest in qualitative improvements in its offensive capabilities, its commitment to funding nuclear weapons development, even while its economy is in a weak state, is not a problem that's going away. The United States should and will continue to treat Russia as the preeminent driver of U.S. nuclear policy. I think we should ask ourselves what could drive China to perceive a need to increase its nuclear arsenal, and that should be the driving element of U.S. arms control policy towards China. If this is a core tenet of the U.S. arms control approach to China, that is to say not to spook Beijing and racing to parity, abandoning no first use, alerting its ICBMs, then signaling that the United States and Russia are going to maintain an arms control relationship is especially important to engaging China in arms control. We shouldn't allow New START to expire and potentially invite China to race to parity with the United States, because they have the capability to do so and they have the financial means to do so. Because that will make China a much larger challenge down the road.
Thank you. My time's expired, so I'll call on Mr. McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, Admiral Mullen, thank you for your service to our nation over the many years. We all have a great deal of respect for you, sir. And I just want to ask you first, there are many who say, you can't trust Russians, and I don't. But our State Department did say that they are in compliance with New START. What would be the negative consequences of pulling out of the New START agreement?
If I were to go back to the negotiations, and Ms. Gottmuller here has spent most of her life in these kind of negotiations, this was really my first. But the difficulty of the negotiations were the technical details. How many inspections? What were the national technical means? We need you to leave a certain site that you've been able to inspect alone in the future. They were really hard-nosed negotiations. That said, once we reached the agreement on the details, they've been seemingly very compliant. Certainly all the evidence seems to speak to that. We lose all that, quite frankly. We lose the opportunity to basically, do the verify side of trust but verify. And if we can't verify it, there's no way we can know. And I think in the openings, some of the opening statements in Rose's opening statement, what Russia is doing in terms of developing new capability, larger warheads, larger missiles, what they could actually put to use beyond these limits very quickly, it's pretty scary. And then we're in a position where are we back in the arms race that we thought we'd sort of up through, the end of the Cold War, we'd sort of left behind. And we're much closer to that than I thought we ever would be again. And that's why this treaty in particular is so critical. We're in the dark, basically, if we walk away.
And that was exactly the point I was going to make. It seems to me we do get intelligence out of this, and without this, we would go dark, and potentially an arms race would start. So the other arguments we hear is, as you talked about China, I agree that we need to look at China. But the fact is, as you point out, Admiral, they're not part of this agreement, and they're not a signatory to this agreement. Although I do think we need to look at China and these other expansive weapons that are not part of the agreement, but more the exotic, the hypersonic weapons, for instance. Secretary Gott Mueller and perhaps to the three of you, how can we accommodate those critics? In other words, would it make some sense to have as maybe a precondition to an extension of New START to have conversations and a strategic dialogue with Russia and China on these new weapons and also on China's nuclear capability?
The biggest issue now, I think, sir, is to look for ways to incentivize China to come to the negotiating table. And to my mind, that kind of strategic stability discussion and trying to exercise some kind of leverage out of the extension of New START on China, they will simply not be levered in that way, in my mind. And so I think it's more important to look for what will incentivize them to come to the negotiating table. And to my mind, they are in a position where they could be essentially convinced that they are facing a major proliferation of particularly intermediate-range missile systems in Eurasia, and they are going to have to, if they want to address that, what will be a severe threat to Beijing over time, they are going to have to come to the negotiating table. So it's a bit of a long game with China, and I think there is a role for a strategic stability type discussion with them, but I don't think they will be levered by extension of New START. I think what they will be levered at is that they're going to be scared at the notion that they'll be facing more missiles pointed at them. Not only they're worried about the United States, of course, and I don't know what the plans are by the United States to deploy intermediate range systems in Asia particularly, but Russia, their nemesis in South Asia, India, these are countries who have very capable missiles, and that's what's going to bring them to the table, thinking about what the threats to them are.
And Mr. Vadi and Mr. Myers.
I'll be brief. I think there are actually some things the administration has done that it can take credit for that have not been tied to the New START extension question. So, I believe the United States has approached China about a strategic dialogue in this administration. The United States has engaged in the Permanent 5 strategic stability process. That's the 5 permanent nuclear powers of the UN, UK, France, United States, Russia, and China. So there's been some importance placed on discussing multilateral strategic stability in that way. Now, as far as making it a precondition to extension, I find it hard to believe that Russia would refuse to extend the treaty if it's based on needing to engage China in some kind of diplomatic dialogue. So I think it's completely appropriate. If that's something that the administration can take credit for and then extend the New START treaty as well, that's, to me, an appropriate policy decision.
I think that's a great idea. Mr. Myers?
Mr. McCall, let me be very clear. I'm not suggesting that engaging the Chinese is a precondition to extending New START. In fact, just the opposite. I think we need to extend and use that opportunity to engage not only on the new delivery systems, but potentially on China. Whether or not they become a member of the New START treaty or its extension, what have you, is almost immaterial. The engagement and the negotiations, whether that comes out as part of a trilateral or a separate bilateral, to me it makes no difference. But extension has to happen for us to be in a position to accomplish those additional goals. So that's why I really believe we have to extend first before we can really get into a serious discussion.
Well, I think this president, he likes bilateral talks, not multilateral, and that would fall in line with what you're saying.
Correct.
This would be separate, and he's having separate negotiations with President Xi as we talk, speak anyway, yeah.
Certainly, yes, sir.
Okay, I yield whatever time I have left, which is none.
Thank you. Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here. About 4 months ago, in the subcommittee of this committee, dealing with Europe and Eurasia, we did have a similar hearing on whether to, extend START or start over. And I think it's important to note that the witnesses we had at that hearing underscored absolutely everything you're saying here today. They're former state and former defense officials, and you all know them, people like Tom Countryman and Madeline Creedon and folks like Brian McKeown. So that much we know. But they mentioned, as you mentioned, the issue that Russia hasn't cheated on this. They've been in compliance. And I'd like to ask you all, why do you think Russia has done this with this treaty, which it didn't do with INF and other treaties? What's in it for them that they haven't violated this treaty?
I don't have a better answer than the one I already gave. They have negotiated these treaties for decades. They have, by and large, been very compliant. I'm obviously very familiar with the details of this, which they have, as far as I can tell, complied with. And they've committed, in fact, listening to some of their public statements, they've committed that they'd agree to continue it. It's hard, very difficult for me to understand, the Russian mind in that regard, why they are that way, and then why they were cheating on the other ones. But they haven't, as best we can tell, they have not cheated on this. And I think we have to assume, at least based on what we know, that they're not, even though it's always possible. But they've been, if I regressively look at this, over decades, they have basically complied.
Ms. Gottenholler?
Sir, the Russians have an enormous regard for our strategic nuclear arsenal. They see it as a potent force, one that is targeted at them. And that, at the heart of it, it's the same reason why we engage in these negotiated strategic arms limitations and reductions, in order to ensure that we keep under control that most significant threat of weapons of mass destruction attack. So I think that's right front and center in what motivates the Russians to engage in these kinds of treaties and to continue to implement them. But furthermore, there's some real bread and butter issues. We've talked about the notification regime providing us a real-time look at the Russian nuclear arsenal. These notifications provide them a real-time look at our strategic nuclear arsenal. So they know when our submarines are getting ready to deploy. They know when our ICBMs are getting ready to go into maintenance. This kind of mutual predictability has been mutually stabilizing, and so I think they have an important reason and rationale in that realm as well.
Could I follow up with one of your other statements that you said in your opening remarks? You had mentioned our NATO allies. After the INF Treaty, after we moved away from that, which NATO did agree with, although they agreed, I could tell you that there were great concerns and disappointments with our allies that we didn't consult with them during that process and bring them in the loop more than we did. How important, hopefully as we begin these discussions, how important is it to bring those allies of ours into the loop and make sure they know what's going on from our perspective?
I want to begin my remarks, sir, by giving some good credit to this current administration, who did provide a significant amount of information, including intelligence information, that enabled our allies to determine that Russia, independently, that the Russians indeed are in violation of the INF Treaty with this new SSC-8 missile. So there was a good deal of consultation. It took some time, and there were some frustrations, just as you've said, but in the end of the day, a good deal of information was provided, and the allies did independently determine the violation. That said, going forward, New START obviously is a bilateral treaty between the Russian Federation and the United States, but as I mentioned a few moments ago, allies see it as part and parcel of their deterrence and defense agenda as well, and so they will be very keen to have tight consultations both on the extension of the treaty and what goes forward as well in terms of further reduction negotiations.
Great. Any other comments? Mr. Batty?
Sure, I'll agree with the previous two witnesses' statements. The one thing I'll add is New START has an effective operational verification regime, which sets it apart from the INF Treaty. The INF Treaty's verification regime expired in 2001. New START, meanwhile, inspectors from Mr. Meyer's former organization have the opportunity to crawl over Russian nuclear bases 18 times a year. They are confirming data that the Russia provides to the United States through the data exchanges and notifications, and making sure that the warhead counts, the locations of missiles on a system-by-system basis are where the Russians are saying they are. As a result, I think Russia is deterred from cheating on the New START treaty. A broader point is that I think as Ms. Gottemoeller said, Russia would be scared to death of a strategic arms race with the United States. They can't keep pace financially or technologically with the United States on these types of technologies.
I agree.
Thank you. Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panel for your expertise and your leadership for decades. You know, the 18 short notice on-site inspections each year, maybe you can give us a little further insight what the proximate cause is when we decide on a short-term basis we're going to go and we're going to look at this, what often triggers that, how sure are we, what's the degree of confidence that somehow we're seeing what we think we're seeing. I mean, they are very adept at hiding and concealing. Let me ask you, too, if the U.S. were to push China's inclusion, how serious would Russia's demands be that France, with its 300 nuclear weapons, and the U.K. with 200 or so nuclear warheads, be included as well? Would that become like a make or break, and the next thing you know, the whole thing implodes because of that expansion? The megatonnage, when warheads are being replaced, is that part of this as well? Is it just not the number of MIRV nuclear weapons going on an ICBM, or is it how big are they, how lethal they are? And then when it comes to modernization, how does extending or not extending New START affect each nation's modernization plans? I know from everything I've read and been following, and you've kind of said it today, you know, they would be unleashed to do even more, so would we be in like fashion. But you know, to me, modernization means more lethal, more accurate, maybe safer, and that's a good component, but more lethal. I mean, again, getting back to the megatonnage, are we looking at something that just manages the old MAD theory, or you know, and what has ever happened to that? And we know the mutual assured security concept during Carter, then into Reagan, became very much a better talking point than just obliterate both sides. And where are we on that? You know, how does that factor into all of this? But again, those first questions, if you could. Admiral Mullins?
Actually, what I'd like to do is just get at the modernization issue, because that became such a big part of the last negotiation. Although, as far as I know, basically it was, were we going to be able to carve out enough money to commit to the modernization of our systems, which was badly in need at the time. And it was about more capability. It was about technically, it was also about upgrading them and being able to test them, obviously, in a non-explosive way to make sure that actually the systems could respond. And there was an awful lot of that which was in play, a lot of money that was set aside in the budget to be able to do that. I know that that has been in great part invested, but I couldn't tell you today that we're where we want to be. I know we're very committed to that, and that was part of what, and listening to General Mattis, or to Secretary Mattis's testimony, I know he was committed to that as well.
Mr. Byers.
Yes, sir. With regard to the inspections, the first part of your question, I'm going to be a little bit careful here in terms of how we pick targets, because that's done by an interagency process. But we make 2 points. First and foremost, everything is done very, very deliberately. Everything is done in a very informed way, whether that's being informed by national technical means or whether it's being done by the very data exchanges and notifications that we've discussed before. The data exchanges and the notification give us a kind of a basis of evidence that we try to prove or disprove. But the goal, obviously, is whenever you do one of these inspections, you're going to try to accomplish multiple things all at the same time, whether it be verifying a data exchange, a notification, an inspection, whatever the case might be. And the way the treaty provisions are written up, the team goes in and doesn't have to announce where they want to go in Russia until a considerable amount of time has gone by. And we're able to watch what happens as a result of that. And we're able to adjust. And we're able to make an awful lot of decisions on the fly, if you will. And the one thing I want to assure you is none of that is haphazard. None of it. The teams train, the teams exercise, and the teams deploy in a very, very militaristic way, if you will. They train like a military unit to carry out these events. And as a result, I have no doubt whatsoever that the quality of the information that we are getting is heads and shoulders above what others are doing. But if I could take 1 second, going back to one of the earlier questions, the Russians don't have the national technical means that we do. They're relying on these inspections even more than we are. But I will tell you, even with that in mind, we are bringing back, because of the quality, because of the investment, because of the training exercise, better information to our decision leaders.
Thank you. Mr. Bera.
If at some point, Mr. Chairman, if they could speak whether or not the UK and France, is that something Russia would require as part of an expansion with China?
Yeah, Mr. Bera.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I agree with and associate myself with a lot of the comments that have already been discussed and the importance of an extension of New START. But if we look backwards, when the START Treaty expired in 2009 without a replacement, there was a close to 1-year gap between the expiration of START and the coming into force of New START. Maybe, Ms. Gottemiller, what did we lose in that gap, and what lessons can we learn from looking back at that 1-year gap?
Thank you, sir. That is a good question. We were concerned about it at the time. We were engaged in a very active negotiation. We were pushing hard, both Moscow and Washington, with clear political guidance to get this treaty done. And so there was a real incentive during that hiatus year between December 2009 and when New START entered into force in February of 2011. There was a real incentive not to undermine the principles that were inherent in START. So we did take care to ensure that, for example, one of us didn't rush to deploy a lot of new warheads, which is what I've mentioned in my testimony I'm concerned about. The question in my mind comes not when we're engaged in active negotiations, when we're pressing forward, there's clear political guidance, we know both sides want to get this treaty done. It's if, there's nothing replacing it and no process replacing it, and then do we descend into an arms race? So that's the real worry in that case. If I may address very quickly the question about UK and France, in fact, we have always been assiduous at the negotiating table not to allow the independent nuclear arsenals of UK and France to fall onto the table, and that has been a clear and really unrelenting position of the United States at the negotiating table now for several decades. And so we would want to keep them off the table. I do have some concern, frankly, if China's in the mix, that all of a sudden, okay, why don't we bring UK and France into the mix as well? So that is a concern, but it has not been our policy up to this point.
So, going back to my original question, circumstances have changed between 2009 and 2010, and if we fast forward to U.S.-Russian relations in 2020 timeframe, would you say Russia still has that same posture where if New START were to expire, that there would be an urgency of continuing the negotiation to come up with a new agreement? Or is Russia looking at the scenario differently today?
From what I hear from Mr. Putin, sir, I would not be confident of that. I would think more that they would be enthusiastic about continuing to develop apace new nuclear capability, unconstrained by any treaty.
So they would be, again, circumstances have changed. Russia would be in favor of seeing an expiration here.
At this moment, they too are concerned about the U.S. arsenal modernization, so I think there is an interest in Moscow in seeing New START extended. We hear that time and again from the Russians. They see an interest, a security interest in the treaty. But should the treaty go away, my only point is that, as my colleague, Mr. Vadi, said, they will put the necessary resources into doing what they think they need to do to maintain a nuclear edge, and even perhaps some nuclear, beyond the nuclear edge, some nuclear superiority.
Right, and the danger there is if we see that they are advancing, that prompts us to then redeploy. So there is a necessary urgency right now to have that negotiation start moving forward, et cetera. If I'm an optimist, and to work in this body at this particular moment in time, you have to be an optimist and think about what that future looks like. Obviously, it's not in China's interest to see a nuclear arms race taking place between the United States and Russia and intermediary strategic assets. You know, when I think about India, and we don't have an accurate number of what their capabilities are, but what I can find on the internet is anywhere from 130 to 140 nuclear weapons, whether that's accurate or not. I imagine China has concerns about India's expansion. I know certainly India and Pakistan have their intentions there. What are the possibilities of, you know, again, making sure there's not a nuclear arms race between India and Pakistan? And maybe, Mr. Vadi, you could touch on that briefly.
Sure, and I won't pretend to be an expert on South Asian nuclear affairs, but I think, you know, to relate it back to the U.S.-China arms control policy debate, one of the issues that we will face in approaching China once you get past this argument that, you know, China has so many fewer nuclear weapons is going to be China taking a look at its own regional security situation, and that will necessarily drag in China's worries about India, China's concerns about our allies in East Asia. And what I'm trying to convey is that this becomes a very, very complicated negotiation very quickly, as opposed to this question of extension between the U.S. and Russia for a bilateral agreement, which, again, as the two largest nuclear powers, it just makes sense to continue to have that process in place.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mast.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate it. As I'm sitting here trying to think about and analyze what's going on with New START, I want to ask a question a little bit outside of that whoever feels they're most apt, most educated, can offer the most profound statements on. Whoever wants to answer this, answer it. As we sit here and think about China and Russia, and we think about our history of nuclear policy, whether it be mutually assured destruction or ladders of escalation or selective ambiguity, can you explain to us right now what is the posture of Russia and of China today? And obviously, this doesn't exist in a vacuum where we're only talking about unconventional weapons. They have conventional weapons as well, and you know, totally different world now. What we deal with China compared to the Cold War with Russia and the engagement in the global economy and what's going on out there with global militaries or regional militaries. Can you talk a little bit about that? So as we think about New START, we think a little bit about how did they think of nuclear weapons defensively, offensively, not just as a first-use weapon or not, but more broadly?
It's a great question. I mean, I've kind of believed that in this century, the most important relationship, bilateral relationship, is going to be between the U.S. and China. That's principally driven by the economy and everything that sort of follows to that. What I've been one of my biggest concerns with our relationship with Russia is it's gotten so bad that it's actually pushed Russia and China together in a way that I couldn't normally or have ever imagined. They've got I think it's a 1,100-kilometer border that they've been fighting across for a long time. They're not natural friends. And yet in this environment that I find ourselves with, struggling with a relationship with China for lots of reasons, and I'm not critical of that, they're going to be a tough country to engage and move forward constructively. But I see Russia more and more aligned with China. Just the other day, there was I think they signed a contract for an energy bill that was unimaginable just a few years ago as a relationship. I don't know how far that's going to go. That, to me, speaks to the vital requirement to figure out how to work with Russia in a way that doesn't cement that relationship for the better part of the century, which I think would be bad for us and bad for the world.
If I may, I will just add that Admiral Mullen's quite right. There's been a long history of conflict between Russia and China. We don't see it at the moment. They're in a significant, I would say, more than marriage of convenience at the moment, and it's related to economic cooperation also because Russia is under a lot of sanctions, and so it deals with China instead of with Europe and the United States, the rest of the world. So there are a lot of reasons for them to be close together now. My view, though, of the intermediate-range nuclear weapon, the N9M729, that the Russians have now built and deployed is that it had an aspect to it of being a response to the deployment of these systems in Asia. And so it is if, although the Russians will never say this outright, they'll never admit it, but they have talked about the proliferation of these systems across Eurasia, beginning with China, as being a reason why they themselves need these missiles. So there is that aspect, I think, that we need to keep in the back of our minds, even as we watch a strong marriage at the present moment.
I'll just add one fact to that point. When Russia first started modernizing its Cold War era short-range ballistic missile systems with the new Iskander system it deployed in the mid-2000s, the first areas of deployment were actually in East Asia. It wasn't that long ago, in that 2005 to 2007 timeframe, that a former Russian defense minister complained publicly about there being more Chinese-speaking citizens in Siberia in the east of Russia than there were Russian-speaking citizens. So they were very aware of the threat that China posed as its defense military capabilities were growing over time. So for now, the relationship to be warming to me is both good for them in international bodies because they're presenting a front against the United States and playing spoiler more often than not, but also complicates U.S. arms control policy and U.S. arms control thinking when it applies to East Asia.
Not to be overly dramatic, but both want to end the American century. They want a multipolar world. They want their own spheres of influence. And they want to make sure that they keep the United States out. To me, I know it's rather brusque to say it that way, but at the end of the day, I think that's the basis.
Thank you all for your analysis. I
Thank
yield
you
back,
very,
Mr. Chairman.
thank you very much. Ms. Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is really directed to any of you who feel that you are able to help me out, and I'm going to ask you a few different questions. I'm very, very concerned about what appears to be an implicit coordination or approval of a new arms race. On December 22nd of 2016, President Trump tweeted that the United States, this is a quote, "United States must greatly strengthen and expand its nuclear capability until such time as the world comes to its senses regarding nukes," end quote. On that very same day, during a Defense Ministry board meeting, Vladimir Putin said that, quote, "There is a need to strengthen Russia's strategic nuclear forces and develop missiles capable of penetrating any current and prospective missile defense systems," end quote. I guess my first question is whether you would agree with me that those two statements taken together almost appear to imply steps towards a 21st century nuclear arms race between the United States and Russia. Admiral Mullen?
I mean, tied specifically to the purpose of this hearing and whether we should extend New START or not, I think the chances of igniting that kind of race go up exponentially if we don't extend, first point. Secondly, and I think you were talking about 2016, I've seen reports in the media as recently as this morning that Putin and President Trump have actually talked in a constructive, positive way about getting together on this treaty. So it's difficult to know, as it oftentimes is, what's real here. I'm encouraged by that, quite frankly, because if they send that signal, I think it will be relatively easy to do that. So maybe I'm more optimistic and pessimistic at this point because of their recent public statements about where this should go.
Assuming that they maintain those positions.
Yes, ma'am.
Anybody else care to comment? Mr. Vadi?
Sure. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
I think that there has been and maybe always will be an incipient qualitative arms race, even when the U.S.-Russia nuclear relationship is governed by a treaty. Past arms control treaties such as the START treaty banned specific types of technologies like air-launched ballistic missiles, strange basing arrangements for ICBMs. New START permits a little bit more flexibility on both sides because both parties are modernizing their nuclear forces. What's important about New START is it caps the quantitative arms race. Each country can only deploy so many operational, readily available for use nuclear weapons at a given moment. And that's why continuing New START is important to curbing the arms race where possible. I mean, again, going back to my previous comments, the U.S. has technological capabilities and know-how that Russia does not. And I find it hard to believe that the U.S. would not approach a negotiation for a new arms control agreement, whether that's bilateral or multilateral, without seeking to preserve some of those advantages.
Thank you. Anybody else want to comment on that?
If I may, I'll just briefly comment.
Thank you.
I have been concerned that there is clearly there are competing budgetary demands, and Admiral Mullen already referred to how we've had to think carefully about how we will get the right support, the degree of support needed for the modernization of the U.S. nuclear arsenal over the next decade. Very important debates in this country about that, budgetary concerns to focus on. I begin to worry that Mr. Putin doesn't face any of those same constraints, and if he chooses to put in place and continue a pretty irrational program like this so-called Buryavestnik, the nuclear-armed cruise missile that is so dangerous because it is highly radioactive. The propulsion system's highly radioactive, so difficult to operate. We abandoned these kinds of systems in the 50s because they were so dangerous to operate. So here we have a certain discipline that the budgetary process applies, which I fear does not apply in the Russian Federation.
And if I could just stay with you, is mutual assured destruction still a legitimate deterrent?
I think the importance we have now is that we have the parity, the balance of forces, and that we both have a good reliability and redundancy in our forces, and so they know that they cannot get away with a first strike, that in fact they would suffer a devastating retaliatory strike. So in that way, they are deterred, and it's the same for us.
Thank you. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Mrs. Wagner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Over here. Russian officials have said they agree that arms control treaties should include other nuclear-armed nations, although these statements seem to have been aimed at the inclusion of U.S. allies like the UK and France. Ms. Scott-Muller, given Russia and China's fraught recent history and physical proximity, does Russia have a national security interest in drawing China into New START and other arms control treaties? And can we expect Russia to take an active role in bringing China to the table?
It's a good question, ma'am. They have taken China's part in recent periods while China has been holding everyone at arm's length in this administration and saying, we do not want to participate.
Right.
And the Russians have essentially said, well, you hear what China says, they don't want to participate. So up to this point, they have not in any way tried to press China to come to the negotiating table. I do think, just as you say, that there are certain incentives on the Russian side for them to help get the Chinese into a process. The Chinese have never had to negotiate on limits or reductions of any kind. And in this sphere. So I can see the rationale there, but at the moment, they have not been pressing them.
Admiral Mullen, has the United States nuclear force posture been based on the treaty's extension and certainty that it provides? And if so, how would a failure to extend New START impact the military's strategic stability planning, how much you've affected existing nuclear modernization plans and such?
I would, first of all, I literally don't have the details because I'm not on the inside anymore, but my expectation would be that we've been very much in compliance, first of all. Secondly, and it's come up a couple times, I think it's really important to make sure that we have the resources dedicated to the upgrading of our and modernizing of our industry, of our nuclear arsenal, if you will. I really don't know where that stands. That was actually negotiated as a part of the ratification process, so it's not cemented into the treaty itself, and it was a commitment on both sides to provide the resources. And so committing to that would put us in a position, and I think as Ms. Gottmuller has stated, put us in a position, and the other witnesses, to actually move ahead if this thing just, if this stopped. I don't advocate for that because I think there are lots of downsides associated with that. So I think we're fully in compliance. We are as ready as we are required to be, and I wouldn't be overly concerned about that. If I were concerned about one thing, it'd be where we stand in the modernization and upgrade.
Yes. That, I'm just wondering how it does affect our existing nuclear modernization plans.
You mean if we walk from this?
Yes.
I think I mean, it's quite frankly going to depend on the priority for the administration. It's a lot of money. I think my recollection was back in 2010, the number was about $5 billion that we needed to put into it, to commit to in the FIDP at that particular point in time. So it's billions. How much of it's, and I know we have invested a lot, it would be based on the status and the priorities for the administration to upgrade and continue to commit resources to the entirety of the nuclear capability.
Thank you, Admiral Mullen. Mr. Myers, do you believe there are any gaps in the verification regime? And if so, what can we do to improve them as part of the talks for an extension?
Well, thank you for the question. It's a hard question to answer because you don't know what you don't know. But the level of confidence here in the United States on our ability to detect non-compliance on the Russian side is very, very high. That's number one. Number two, over the life of the New START treaty, we have no evidence of cheating on their part. Three, and to me this is the most important, the individuals charged with carrying out the verification missions were also involved in the drafting of the verification procedures and the language. I commend Undersecretary Gadamoller at the time and Chairman Mullen at the time for having the DTRA inspectors at the table with them, because it wasn't an issue of something's negotiated and it's delivered to the inspectors and said, now go do it. They were
Verifiers were there at the table during.
Absolutely. So at the end of the day, treaties are compromises. You never get everything you want. But I will tell you, having talked and walked and watched these individuals do their job and exercise, they were very confident.
Great, thank you. My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Levin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to commend you and the ranking member for your leadership on this issue, for holding this hearing, and for doing it in a bipartisan way. I want to follow up on my good colleague from Missouri's questions, Mrs. Wagner, about what if this goes away? I mean, if New START went away, if we, for whichever reason, we would have no limits on Russia's nuclear forces for the first time since 1972. And this would come at a time when Russia has been modernizing its nuclear forces. So what would happen if either New START expires without it being extended, or if the U.S. withdraws from the treaty? I'm asking you in a broader sense, and in particular about what Russia would do in your estimation. Mr. Vadi?
Sure. Thank you for your question. Maybe I'll focus my remarks on what we lose in terms of information. And
Yeah.
I'm happy for others to hopefully chime in on the broader Russia strategic intentions question. So, as I mentioned before, New START verification and monitoring works hand in hand with the intelligence community. Admiral Richard, who's the new incoming Strategic Command commander, mentioned in responding to hearing questions that the intelligence community would likely have to adjust its collection priorities and capability investments to compensate for the loss of information provided by data exchanges and inspections if New START were to go away. In reality, it's unlikely that the intelligence community could replicate the information gained through New START, and we're not talking about the United States government, which publicly declares information related to its strategic nuclear forces. In 2014, the U.S. military put on the DoD website our plan for a New START force structure. We're talking about the Russian government, and it's unlikely the Kremlin is going to publicly share information regarding its nuclear forces. Right now, it is forced to share that information with U.S. government experts as part of the New START treaty. The effects may not be immediate. It may not be February 6th or 7th of 2021. We see the problem, the lack of confidence that starts to emerge. It'll be in the years afterwards. And as others have spoken about, and Ms. Gadamoller made this comment specifically, we don't necessarily know what Russia may do if the treaty is allowed to expire. But given Vladimir Putin's behavior over the past decade plus, One, we can be sure that there's some contingency plan. I think the Russians are long-term planners. And two, what that will likely result in is the U.S. having to take another look at its own modernization planning, its own intelligence collection assets, and moving priorities away from other collection targets like North Korea, Iran, China, and other countries that have missile programs.
Admiral Mullen, I know you're not on the inside anymore, but, I just wonder, I just have grave concern about this situation for nuclear proliferation and for what happens between our country and Russia if this goes away. What are your thoughts?
This is almost a signal that it's okay to increase around the world, quite frankly, anybody that's got nuclear weapons to increase the size of their arsenal, one. The other is strategically, I couldn't tell you the exact year, but of 2002, 3, 4, Putin made a very conscious decision to invest in his strategic forces, and he continues to do that. And yes, he's got limited resources, we know that, but he's been very consistent here over what is now almost 2 decades to continue to make that investment. And there's we don't know for sure what would happen, but certainly based on what I know or what I think I know about him, he would continue to invest. And quite frankly, can we take the risk that that leaving the New START would generate in terms of a future arms race, and then try to get a handle on that? I think the risk of that is far too high, despite the fact we wouldn't know for sure what he would do.
And what does it do to our ability to get China and others to the table to reduce nuclear arsenals, across the board? Secretary Gottemoeller.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Sir, I don't see any impetus or leverage for the Chinese to join in a negotiation should New START go away. And furthermore, I wanted to stress the point I made in my opening remarks that the Russians have a capability to upload warheads and do it rather quickly. So without deploying a single additional missile, they could go from 1,550 deployed warheads, possibly to as many as 2,550 deployed warheads. That's a big targeting problem for our strategic command and could result in some significant difficulties and crises in terms of stability.
My time's expired. Go ahead, Mr. Myers. Well,
Yeah.
briefly, I guess,
yes,
since my time's
yes, sir.
expired.
No, yes, sir. One of my concerns, to add on to everything else was said, is the longer a gap would extend, the greater chances for miscalculation. Because you've heard already about our concerns about how much we would see, how much we would know without the data exchanges,
Right.
without the inspections. The Russians don't have anywhere near the capabilities that we do beyond those things to make any kind of determination on intent. And without those types of things, the chances of miscalculations inevitably go higher as time goes on.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Perry.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I thank the panel for their attendance today. Just listening to my good friend and his questions, Ms. Gottemoeller, I was going to ask a question about China, assuming that we do a New START treaty which encumbers the United States and Russia. What is the impetus for China to constrain themselves? What is the impetus for Pakistan to constrain, or anybody? And you said that without the treaty, there would be no constraint, there would be no leverage. But what is the leverage if those other countries aren't included, but America and Russia are constrained?
As my colleague, Mr. Vadi, pointed out, sir, the Chinese have so many fewer strategic nuclear delivery vehicles, very much smaller strategic nuclear arsenal. I really think the incentive for the Chinese can be developed in the near-term period, getting a handle on their intermediate range systems, which are the ones that are the so-called carrier busters. They're the ones that really concern our military as well. So if we can create an incentive for the Chinese to start to constrain those systems because they're worried about proliferation, Russian proliferation of such systems, perhaps the United States, India, Pakistan, et cetera, that's where I think we could begin to get some traction with the Chinese on limitations and constraint. But because their arsenal is so much smaller in terms of strategic nuclear weapons, it's very hard to think about how they would agree to constrain when the U.S. and Russia are up at 700 delivery vehicles and they are way, way down in terms of numbers of ICBMs. Forgive me, sir, I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but very, very few numbers by comparison with ours.
Doesn't it give them a kind of a blank check if we're constrained and they don't have to be concerned with any current constraints at all? Doesn't it give them a kind of a blank check to work on both?
I think we have to be very alert to them. We call it rushing to parity, that they would try to rush to parity with
What would
the
stop
United States
them?
and
I don't
Russia.
see anything that would stop them except resources.
Yeah, well, at the time, their doctrine stops them. They say they are committed to only no first use and a second strike, capability, and that's it. But we have to keep a very sharp eye to see if they are changing that policy.
Sir, if I could.
Yes, sir.
Just make a quick comment. Pakistan's come up a couple times. I mean, the deficit that Pakistan has military with respect to India, and India is their existential threat, can only be made up to some extent with their nuclear arsenal. That is their ticket to the future, and that's how they see it. And getting at that long term, that's not going to happen quickly. I spent a lot of time in Pakistan tied to the Afghan war specifically, and so it's a huge challenge. My own view of that is this is the responsibility of a country like India to figure out how they're going to make that work, and until we see them starting to work together in a way that incentivizes both of their future, Pakistan is going to continue to build them just to take care of itself. Otherwise, and it is a deterrent for them because on the conventional side, India could overwhelm Pakistan just like that.
So it seems to me, based on the conversation, I'm trying to figure out what the right answer is on New START because I hate to constrain ourselves, and I understand from Mr. Myers and from others that there haven't been infractions on the current treaty that we know of, which is curious but good. But I am concerned about leaving some of the other actors out while we pursue this, constrain ourselves, and don't engage them at all. And I wonder if this is an opportunity that we should take to maybe they're not included in New START, but maybe they're engaged in something separately at the same time, since it's going to be topical. Everybody's going to be watching, and it's an opportunity to say, we're not absolving you folks either. And I agree, Ms. Ghana, they're not going to. They might rush to parity, and they're certainly not going to want to be constrained where they are, knowing China in particular where we are, but I'm not sure we see the entire picture, or we're looking at the entire picture right now, and I think that's a little concerning. Just out of curiosity, because there have been infractions from Russia on other agreements, why do you suppose that there either are none or we have found none? And I think generally the consensus is we feel they have been good actors on. Why is that? Because they put their attention elsewhere? Because I don't believe it's all goodwill. Sorry, I just don't. Yes, sir.
I'll get a start. I know the Admiral has discussed this a little bit earlier, and I'll leave time for him to respond. But they have as much to gain from this arms control process as we do. They truly do. They are extremely worried and concerned about our strategic systems. They understand, and I think make a differentiation between intermediate and strategic. I also think that there is a level of recognition that, given our capabilities, that we would catch them. None of these are definitive, and none of these are the exact, no questions asked, that's the answer to the question. But I think these all make up part of the Russian psyche. I think it's all part of their decision-making. I think at the end of the day, they also understand the benefit of the United States being constrained. And having that helps them. No matter how they are always trying to get the edge, just like we are, no matter how they're always trying to come up with a new, improved, better, what have you, I think at the end of the day, they have as many benefits of this as we do, and they don't want to see it go either.
Thank you very much. Ms. Bamberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much to our witnesses today for being here. And I'd like to start with a question for you, Ms. Godmuller. Former National Security Advisor John Bolton suggested that if there were political will on both sides, the United States and Russia would be able to extend New START or even negotiate a new treaty before the February 2021 deadline. So my question is actually a feasibility question, because recent press reports indicate that the State Department's Office of Strategic Stability and Deterrence Affairs has declined from 14 staffers in 2017 to 4 currently. And this is the office that is generally considered to house much of State Department's expertise regarding U.S.-Russian arms control agreements. Similarly, many of the remaining senior leadership members and political appointees at the State Department do, in fact, not have the same level of experience in arms control negotiations that we've seen over the years. So my question is, do you believe that if the administration at this time decided to renegotiate New START, that the State Department would in fact have the necessary resources and personnel and background of experience to restart these discussions, sorry, no pun intended there, and to best represent U.S. interests?
Ma'am, I have taken note of comments of this type in the press and in speaking with people in the administration. I know that there is a view that there has to be a rebuilding of some of those capabilities and capacities, particularly in the State Department, because they have been whittled away in recent years. I will emphasize, though, and I want to refer to a point that Mr. Myers has made several times, the degree to which we benefited during the New START negotiations in having a huge amount of basic expertise among our inspectors who have worked now not only on New START, but back into the INF period from the late 1980s, so years of experience accumulated there, and also weapons operators. They've turned out to be some of the finest diplomats we had working on the negotiations were those guys who had been, and gals, who had been down in the ICBM silos or operating the submarines, the bombers. So we have a lot of natural diplomats in our government. So in the end of the day, I do agree and believe that the rebuilding of the State Department capacity in this regard should be effected, should be carried forward. But we also have a lot of natural talent in the government.
And if you were to go about beginning to renegotiate or begin these discussions, what sort of buildup, and if this is something you can estimate, do you think that it would require to put the necessary personnel in place to begin really meaningful discussions?
Well, as I recollect from my time as Undersecretary, that there is a certain amount of authority that is invested in the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security, and that I think that authority to hire on a rather expedited basis could be put to good use in this regard.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Mr. Myers, would you like to comment or add anything to that?
No, ma'am, other than to confirm what Ms. Gadamuller just said. The Undersecretary, hearkening back to my days as a staffer in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the Undersecretary does have significant amount of authority. It's a brilliantly written piece of legislation, and he or she would have the ability to staff up quickly if needed.
And Mr. Myers, or to anyone else who's serving as a witness today, are there any additional authorities or anything else from a brilliant legislative perspective that you might recommend for the future, for things for us to consider, those of us with oversight over State Department, that would be helpful to either these sorts of negotiations in the future or others?
I think the question on people is a great question, and I'd stay with that. I agree that if this were to happen, the people are out there. They may not be working for the government right now, but they're incredible professionals, and many of them would come back if they knew this was going to be a very viable negotiation and with a potential outcome. The other thing it is legislation, but it isn't, is, where's the money? And that's always an interesting question. And where is it being spent? What are the priorities in the Pentagon, quite frankly, for the arsenal overall, and where do we stand? And getting a chalk line drawn on exactly where we are right now, I think, is really key. And there's an opportunity with the discussion of this to be able to understand that a whole lot better.
Thank you very much. I appreciate all of your participation today. Thank you so much for your comments, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Gottmuller, you spoke in your testimony about the importance of the principle of parity in past and present arms control agreements between the United States and Russia or the Soviet Union in those days. How would that principle even begin to apply to the United States bringing China into this kind of an arms control agreement? I mean, would they have to come up to our level? I can't imagine us going down to their level very quickly. Does the principle apply?
Parity was very much a decision that was made, Soviet Union and the United States, in earlier phases of negotiation about two equals who are deterring each other and deterring each other from a first strike on their forces, on their country. And in the case of China, we have not, as the United States of America, had that same approach or policy. In fact, Chinese doctrine supports a so-called retaliatory approach where they want to have an assured second strike, and they say they have a no first use policy, but they do not seek in the same way to, so to say, threaten us as nuclear equals in the way the Soviet Union did historically and now Russia does. So we are locked in this kind of nuclear embrace with the Russian Federation in the way we have not ever been with China before. So I, at the moment, would look for ways to avoid that.
So this would be one of potentially many complicating factors in bringing China into this framework, which I think brings me back to the question of time. We only have a few months here. Are you or any other witnesses aware that the administration has actually done the groundwork, either with China or, if our goal is to renegotiate the agreement with Russia, to actually begin to have any chance of completing this process in that time frame?
Congressman, I'm aware of several comments that members of the administration and I think the president have indicated. I don't believe there have been any cold hard negotiations or deep discussions. And I again, just to be clear, I think, not to speak for the whole panel, but I think most of us are trying to say extension has to come first. And only then can you create the conditions to bring in additional systems or bring in additional countries. And so I think it's not a is there time to bring in China or include X, Y, and Z, extend and then use that time period to expand.
When you say it has to, it's not just a preference, and it's a necessity. It's a practical necessity. I mean, there's really no other alternative other than the treaty lapsing.
Yes, sir.
Right. Okay. And were it to lapse, Admiral Mullen, you said essentially we would be left with a free-for-all between the United States and Russia. When was the last time there were no treaty constraints on the U.S. and Russian nuclear arsenals?
Well, I mean, Rose is the expert here, but when we get to the first ones in 1972, you know, pretty much everything before that was some version of a free-for-all, and I don't have to, you are a young guy, I don't have to remind you of 1962.
I want you to. Actually, this was my next question.
And what happened?
We have a broader audience, Tom.
Yeah.
Say a little bit about the world before we had these treaty-based constraints.
I mean, back, and I was a relatively young lad at the time, but, you know, there are many people believe that we came very, very close to destroying each other. And then you could argue how much of the world that we almost went to nuclear war obviously without any constraints. And there's no guarantee of going in either direction. It's just that if we let this go, I think the risk goes up enormously that we can't get it right for the future and the danger that's associated with that.
Exactly.
And from my perspective, it's not worth it.
And we therefore chose to make these kinds of agreements with a Soviet Union that was our sworn enemy, rightly so, and it did not actually in any way constrain us from confronting the Soviets on other issues. Arguably, it actually freed us to confront them more safely. Isn't that correct?
It is, and what's important is they chose as well to do the same thing.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Omar.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to our panelists for coming and being part of this important discussion. It's my understanding that every president since Kennedy has started or completed an arms control agreement in their first term. And our current president is on track to break that streak. So I'm curious if you all would talk to us about what are the implications of this particular agreement, the New START, for allowing it to expire. What are the implications? Is it nuclear war? Is there a narrative implication for arms control around the world? And please chime in. I would love to hear from all four of you.
Perhaps I'll start, ma'am. I think this is the year when the Non-Proliferation Treaty is being reviewed, 2020. This, we were discussing a moment ago the Cuban Missile Crisis. It started and trained a number of both multilateral and bilateral negotiations involving the Soviet Union. The NPT was a signal accomplishment that entered into force in the early 1970s and has kept the number of nuclear weapon states sharply constrained in that time. So I think that this is a very important year to send a signal to the whole NPT family that nuclear arms control and reduction still matters. I am concerned, frankly, if New START goes out of force or is seen as unlikely to be extended, that this will deal a significant blow to this larger non-proliferation system that keeps an explosion of nuclear weapon states from occurring on a global basis. So that's a point we haven't gotten to yet today, but I thank you for the opportunity to make it. Extending New START will be a good signal to the international community that we and the Russians still mean business about nuclear arms reduction.
Just one brief comment to add on. Thank you for your question. I think long-term, if the United States signals it is not going to use arms control as a security tool anymore, as a way to sort of peacefully manage relations with adversaries, the intention that signals to adversaries today and potential adversaries tomorrow is that the United States is going to favor freedom of movement for its military and unilateralism as opposed to security cooperation to resolve some of these security challenges that face the U.S. and other countries together. And as Ms. Gottemoeller pointed out, with the review conference next year for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, where there's already an impatience among several non-nuclear armed states that the United States is not doing enough, that other nuclear powers is not doing enough to reduce their stockpiles, there's always potential that countries that are facing regional stability and security issues, such as in the Middle East or in South Asia, will take this as a sign that, in fact, nuclear weapons are going to be around for a very, very long time, and we need to also take steps to increase our own arsenals. That's always the worry.
Admiral, Mr. Meyer.
I don't have a lot to add with respect to that. I worry a great deal that sort of the race is on. That you don't know for sure, but the risk of that happening goes up enormously. This has been a very extensive, long-term, controlled regime to control the most devastating weapons man has ever put on Earth, and we need to continue to do that. And then send the signals, and it's really complex stuff, but send the signals we continue to reduce them. And in that, because this was part of my mindset in 2010 when I negotiated this, with China coming, we're going to have to figure that out. That's a great question, because they're going to continue to build, and they are policy limited right now. And then what happens to the other countries, UK, France, et cetera. Those things need to be negotiated or figured out in the future. But the centerpiece for this, for decades, for safety in the world, have been the Soviets, now Russians, and us, in a very stable agreement over an extended period of time to handle these most dangerous, devastating weapons.
So control through negotiations and making sure that these deals are implemented is important, because I think for a lot of the public who might be watching today, hopefully they're tuning in, they're not easily following this conversation, right? They don't understand that this is a deal that just needs to be extended, and it's one that needs to happen only between the presidents. It's not that Congress is an obstacle to this deal taking place. And so when we hear the president talk about how he is capable of making deals, this is one of those really simple situations where he can make a deal, and he's choosing not to because these are deals that are made by Obama, and in many cases we are getting out of international deals because the previous president is not one that this current president likes to follow, and our world is being placed in danger because of a political spat. And so I thank you all for urgently talking about the need to not allow for this to expire, and for the chairman for allowing this conversation to take place. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Well, this is the moment you've all been waiting for. As you can tell, there was enormous interest in the subject, and I want to thank the four of you for being excellent witnesses. I know I learned a great deal, and I know others did as well. And with all the things going on in Washington today, we certainly had a lot of members here listening to what you have to say. So I thank you for all the work you've done in the past and the work you'll be doing in the future. And I'm always amazed at the wonderful talent we have. I guess that's why things keep working well, despite us raising our hands sometimes and fretting. But we have nothing to fret about, because what I heard today was a lot of clarity and a lot of common sense. And I just hope that we will heed the suggestions and the discussions that you had today. So thank you so much for coming. We're adjourned.